Welcome to My Child Can't Read, a Heartland Crisis, a podcast exploring the reading crisis through the voices of parents, educators, researchers, and families searching for answers. Today's conversation may challenge some assumptions about reading, learning, and human potential itself. You may not agree with every perspective you hear, but beneath this conversation is a question we believe matters deeply. What happens to children when learning becomes a place of shame? In the coming season, we'll hear directly from individuals who have lived that experience. Children, parents, and adults carrying the invisible weight of struggling to learn to read. But first, we begin here. Over the past year, this podcast has explored one central question. How did so many children fall through the cracks of reading instruction, even as research about how children learn to read became more widely available? We've talked about curriculum, teacher preparation, policy, dyslexia, the science of reading, systematic resistance, and the very real human cost of children not learning to read. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. The literacy crisis is never just about literacy. It's about identity, confidence, access, opportunity, and shame, and the systems we build around children. The last season has asked, who holds responsibility? But today's conversation shifts the lens slightly, not away from instruction, but deeper than it. What if the crisis beneath the literacy crisis is even more complex than how we teach reading? What if we still don't fully understand what learning actually feels like inside the mind of a child? Today's guest, David Boulton, creator of Children of the Code, a long-running exploration of reading, language, cognition, and human learning. For decades, his work has challenged educators, researchers, scientists, and technologists to reconsider not just how children learn, but what learning itself is. Some of David's ideas are outside conventional thinking, and not every listener will agree with every conclusion he draws. But after spending a year immersed in the national literacy crisis, I kept returning to one unsettling question. What if we're still missing something fundamental? And maybe even more important, what happens to children when learning itself becomes a place of shame? Before we begin, there's a passage David references during our conversation from a John Steinbeck retelling of the acts of King Arthur and his noble knights. And honestly, I haven't stopped thinking about it. Steinbeck writes, "Some people there are who, being grown, forget the horrible task of learning to read. They forget the confusion of the child mind, the puzzlement, and the pain. And yet it is perhaps the greatest single effort that the human undertakes and must do as a child." Maybe that's where this conversation begins. Not with politics, not with programs, not even with phonics, but with children. And what it feels like when learning stops feeling safe. When I originally invited David onto the podcast, I thought we would spend most of our time discussing foresight. After all, many of the warning signs we see today flatlined reading outcomes, persistent inequities, generational struggle, were already visible decades ago. But very quickly, our conversation shifted somewhere deeper. Instead of focusing only on how children are taught, David challenged the assumptions underneath the entire conversation, and whether the literacy crisis might actually reveal something much larger about learning itself.
I have to somewhat differ with you in the kind of opening conception that we know so much about learning to read. One of the most amazing things is that we've been keeping track of data on this since 1992. And it's been flatlined the entire time. We have barely budged the needle, and despite millions and millions of billions of dollars spent on research, education, on collateral effects, and we haven't moved the needle. For as long as we've been keeping reliable data, it's been flatline. Despite this enormous effort for generations and all of this energy, no real forward progress. And I think the reason for that is that the assumption set's wrong.
One of the things that struck me while listening back to this interview was that David wasn't actually arguing that reading instruction doesn't matter. He was asking a different question. What if the systems surrounding children still don't fully understand the experience of learning itself? And whether you agree with his conclusions or not, it's hard to ignore the reality he points to. For decades, reading outcomes nationally have remained painfully stagnant. Even after massive reform efforts, even after new research, even after growing public awareness. So the question becomes, why? So if I come back to my original premise, could you agree with me that there were signs that our literacy crisis was going to become blaring in our face? Could we agree with that? Like it was heading that way, even just with your recognition of, oh my word, what's going on with my kids?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, there is no such thing as a good old day in literacy anyway. What happened was the world became more dependent on literacy and therefore revealed the literacy problem. It's not like literacy was once great. It was easier to become literate in past generations because of the lack of competing, conflicting attentional demands and attentional options, right?
Okay. I can totally agree with that. Yeah.
But the majority of the population, the level of literacy, if you could go back 100 years, I don't know that it would have been any worse or any better. Right? Maybe probably worse. Probably a little bit worse, just because of exposure. What the 80s and 90s and probably before that indicate was that we've had this massive understanding that we were coming into more and more of an information age that would require higher degrees of literacy to be successful.
Yes.
And so that put more pressure on literacy education and revealed all the stuff that became the basis for all of the energy about trying to do something about it. But again, the fundamental premises, I think, are the problem. Yeah, no, this has been, like I said, the flat line has been predictable. Nothing's changed, and I don't think anything's going to change until we change the way we think about it. You know, it's that we keep trying to improve the wrong things, so the outcome doesn't change.
But where this conversation became most powerful for me was not in the theories. It was in the children. Because underneath every policy debate, every curriculum battle, every statistic, there are actually kids trying to make sense of themselves. And David kept returning to one idea over and over again. That prolonged struggle with reading can slowly become something much deeper than academic difficulty. It can become shame.
With her, what got me is that she just started dying inside. You could see the shame, this bright, energetic, confident young girl who was just full of zest in life, just withering into the shame about this. It just pissed me off. And that's what began Children of the Code. One day we're at this garage sale on the island of Kauai. She's 5 years old. We're just coming into the reading problems. And she pulls up we're at this garage sale, and she comes to me and she brings me this book. And she says, Daddy, do you think this would help you if you read this to me? And I go, and I didn't know John Steinbeck wrote anything like this. I mean, I was familiar with Steinbeck. He was a great guy, And I opened up the book. And in the forward to it, it says, some people there are who, being grown, forget the horrible task of learning to read.
That's so amazing that she picked that up.
It's perhaps the greatest single effort that the human undertakes, and they must do it as a child.
Wow.
And it goes on to just basically say that this guy who became the Nobel Prize winner for literature who's one of the greatest writers of American culture, right? He hated everything to do with writing and reading. He thought it was like devil work. It was horrible. It pained him, right? Until he ran into an old King Arthur manuscript that was written in Old English. And for some reason, the old language made sense to his mind, and it was like, pulled him right in and took off with reading. So he was an example of both the power of the story of reading and the problem of the orthography as it relates to a mind, even a bright mind. And that's what inspired Children of the Code, my daughter, and that.
As a parent and as an educator, that part sat heavy with me. Because so many struggling readers don't just begin to believe reading is hard. They begin to believe they are the problem. And that changes everything.
The main collateral consequence of protracted difficulty with learning to read is the development of this aversion, this unconscious emotional aversion to the bad feeling that accompanies this confusion in reading. And that is itself learning disabling. I would say that learning to read is the biggest single cause of the biggest single acquired learning disability.
This is the aversion. They don't want to learn anymore.
Yeah, they don't want to learn it.
This is too uncomfortable.
It's too uncomfortable. And this reinforces, unfortunately, maladaptive cognitive schemas, right? So one of the common observations of children that struggle to read is that they guess. They try to guess. Why are they guessing? Trying to guess to get the heck out of that feeling. And once they get on the guessing becomes a maladaptive strategy that just continues to work against them. They got to break the strategy, right? So these are learning disabilities. If your mind picks up a model of how to do something and it's wrong, you keep doing it, it's learning disabling, but you learned it. It's not natural, right? That you didn't come with it. If you learn to become shame averse to how bad the confusion feels when you encounter this confusion, right? And that causes your mind to be bifurcated into wanting to avoid it. So you've got less energy to pay attention to it, or you actually want to escape it. All of that stuff is learning disabling too. And again, you didn't come with it, you learned it. So these are acquired learning disabilities that are acquired in the context of learning to read.
Okay.
That's the biggest consequence of protracted reading difficulty. And that's what radiates into our society and into people's lives throughout their life of not feeling good about learning.
Yeah, because why would I do this if I'm just stupid? Because I've taught myself this is true.
It makes me feel stupid. And why should I, who wants to do that?
Right. So I avoid those situations at all costs, which could be a lot of situations in life, a lot of opportunities that turn out to be automatic dead ends in my head.
It's not necessarily something that you're conscious of, or you're consciously aligning and saying, well, this is like reading, so I'm not going to do it. It's more a case of this has that feel to it that your unconscious wants to avoid. So it's a much deeper learning disability.
To be clear, this conversation isn't denying neurological differences like dyslexia, ADHD, or other learning challenges. Rather, it's exploring how prolonged struggle, especially without proper support, can shape a child's emotional relationship with learning itself. I kept thinking about how many adults I've now interviewed who can still remember with startling clarity the moment school began to feel unsafe, the moment learning stopped feeling hopeful, the moment they began hiding. And maybe that's part of what David is trying to name. Not just instructional failure, but what happens when entire systems unintentionally condition children to disconnect from learning itself. As the conversation continued, we moved into another difficult reality. Because the consequences of literacy failure are not evenly distributed. National reading data, including results from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, continue to show persistent disparities in reading outcomes across race and socioeconomic status. And while there are many contributing factors, David argues that literacy struggle often becomes generational, not because families don't care, but because shame, avoidance, limited access, and educational harm compound over time.
I think it's a reflection of everything we've been talking about as it's been concretized in the population over generations. People that grow up improficient with reading in a way that's causing them to feel bad about themselves and avoid it. Well, they have kids. So their kids are growing up witnessing that, experiencing that, watching the adults around them go through life avoiding that stuff. That in itself is a big part of the problem.
And then it persists through them.
And then there's likely not to be a lot of reading material, certainly not evident the kind of diversity or complexity or range or volume of reading material that the upper end of society might have. So all these things compound for generations. So the fact that this correlates with SES and with race and with the other social metrics makes perfect sense. How could it not?
I think it's important to pause here and say this clearly. None of this means children cannot learn. And none of this means families are incapable. In fact, many of the stories we've shared throughout this podcast prove the exact opposite. Children can learn to read. Brains can change. Instruction matters deeply. But this conversation asks us to widen the lens, to consider what environments help children remain connected to learning, and what environments quietly teach children to fear it. There are moments in this interview where David's thinking stretched far beyond conventional literacy conversations, at times into technology, into systems theory, into philosophy, into the future of learning itself. And while not every listener will agree with where he lands, I think there's still value in sitting with the tension. Because beneath all of it was a question I don't think we can afford to ignore. What if education becomes so focused on what children should learn that we stop paying attention to how learning actually feels inside them?
We have to care more about the health of their inside participation than we care about what we think they need to learn. Full stop. And that's with reading and that's with everything else. So long as we continue to think that what we think they should learn is more important than how well they can learn, we're going to screw it up, just like we've always been doing. Once we care about how well they learn and that becomes the center of how we differentiate what we're doing, then we can unfold all kinds of things and stay with that as our deep track, right? But until we get to that point, we're going to continue to. So that's the basis for alignment for me. Is alignment has to be not based on some external connect the dots between systematic programs of what we want as outcomes. The alignment comes from centering everything around nothing's more important than the inner health of their participation in learning.
And I think that idea may feel uncomfortable for some listeners because, yes, children need explicit instruction. They need evidence-based teaching. They need knowledgeable educators. They need structured literacy. This podcast has made that case over and over again. But perhaps David is asking us to widen the lens, to ask not only are children being taught well, but also what kind of emotional relationship to learning are we building inside of them?
What's more important than how well they can learn generally?
That question stayed with me because perhaps the deepest cost of prolonged literacy struggle isn't only academic. It's the moment a child begins to believe learning is not for me. And once that happens, the consequences reach far beyond reading. I don't think this episode is meant to give us easy answers. And honestly, I don't think David Boulton intended it to. What I do think it offers is an invitation to slow down, to think more deeply, to examine not only instruction, but the emotional architecture surrounding learning itself. Because perhaps the greatest tragedy of the literacy crisis isn't only that children struggle to read, it's that many children eventually stop believing they are capable of learning at all. And if that's true, then responsibility becomes bigger than curriculum, bigger than politics, bigger than ideology. It becomes a question of what kind of environments we are building around children. Environments that cultivate shame, or environments that help children remain connected to curiosity, agency, resilience, and hope? Season 4 asked us, who holds responsibility for the literacy crisis? Maybe this conversation leaves us with another question. Are we willing to question the systems and assumptions underneath it? Thank you for listening. This is My Child Can't Read, a Heartland Crisis. I'm Jesica Glover, and I'll see you next time as we begin Season 5. Thanks for listening to My Child Can't Read, a Heartland Crisis. If this episode resonated with you, if you saw your child, your classroom, or your community in these stories, you're not alone. Now is the time to act. Every child can learn to read, and we all share responsibility to make it happen. I invite you to take action today by subscribing to catch every episode, rating and reviewing to help others find this series, sharing your story and learning how the Phillips Fundamental Learning Center is changing lives at funlearn.org/podcast. And by sharing this show with a friend, teacher, or parent who needs to hear it. All resources, source credits, and tools mentioned in this episode can be found in the show notes. Together, we can take responsibility and rewrite the story of literacy. One child, one classroom, and one school at a time right here in the Heartland.